Something unusual is happening ahead of the 2026 World Cup. Not on the pitch, not between national teams, but among the fans themselves. The very people who have spent years following football. The people who have always seen the World Cup as the greatest celebration of the sport. Yet something interesting is beginning to emerge. More and more of them seem to be saying the same thing. Maybe this time, I won't go. At first glance, that sounds like a personal decision. Nothing more than an individual choice. But look a little closer, and it may reveal something much bigger. Because the 2026 World Cup was supposed to be the World Cup for everyone. The biggest tournament in history. 48 national teams. 104 matches. 3 host nations. A competition designed to reach more fans than ever before. And yet, while the World Cup continues to expand, some supporters feel as though they are being pushed further away from it. Not because they have stopped loving football, but because they have started asking a different question. Does football still belong to ordinary fans? Or is it becoming something else entirely? That is where this story becomes far more interesting. Because this is not a story about one country. From Scotland to the United States. From everyday supporters to government regulators. Different stories are beginning to point toward the same question. Who is the 2026 World Cup really serving? The people who love the game? Or a new model that is changing the way the World Cup operates? To find the answer, we need to start with a man in Scotland. A man who waited years for this tournament. A man who dreamed of experiencing a World Cup in person, but who ultimately decided to walk away. His name is Alan Ross, and his story may reveal far more than anyone expected. Alan Ross is a football fan from Scotland, not a celebrity, not a player, not a football executive, just an ordinary supporter. But that is exactly what makes his story important, because people like Alan have always been the heart of the World Cup. For years, he followed the Scottish national team across Europe, booking flights months in advance, saving money for every trip, carefully planning each journey. And when Scotland finally qualified for the 2026 World Cup, he believed the moment he had waited for was finally here. A World Cup in North America, a tournament he felt he simply had to attend. So he went to FIFA's official ticket platform. At first, everything seemed normal. He found ticket prices that appeared manageable. Joined the queue, waited patiently, and then something unexpected happened. By the time he reached the checkout page, the price was higher. He assumed it was bad luck. Maybe next time would be different. So he tried again, and then again. But the same thing kept happening. Each time he entered the queue, he saw one price. Each time his turn arrived, that price had changed, higher than before. It felt as if the ticket was constantly moving further away from him. Eventually, Alan Ross made a decision. He stopped trying. He gave up on attending the World Cup, not because he stopped loving football, not because he no longer wanted to be there, but because he felt the game had changed, and that is where this story becomes much more interesting. Because Alan Ross was not alone. Over the past several months, supporters across Europe, North America, and South America have shared remarkably similar experiences. They saw one price, they joined the queue, and then watched that price change before their eyes. At first glance, this appears to be a simple ticketing story, a story about supply and demand, a story about frustrated fans. But look a little closer, and it leads to a much bigger question. Why is attending the World Cup becoming increasingly difficult for ordinary supporters? What has changed? And why are so many fans beginning to feel that the tournament is drifting further out of reach? To answer that question, we need to examine a concept that has never played such a visible role in a World Cup before. Dynamic pricing, a system where ticket prices can rise and fall based on demand. And for many fans, that may be where the real story begins. After Alan Ross's story, a larger question began to emerge. Why has buying World Cup tickets become so difficult? The answer may lie in a major change that FIFA is applying to the 2026 World Cup. Dynamic pricing, a system where prices change based on demand. At first glance, the idea is not unusual. Airlines use it. Hotels use it. Major concerts use it. When demand rises, prices rise. The logic is simple, and FIFA has every reason to believe demand for the 2026 World Cup will be enormous. This is the biggest World Cup in history. 48 teams, 104 matches, millions of fans hoping to travel to North America. But here is where things become interesting. The controversy is not simply about expensive tickets. It is about how those prices appear to change during the purchasing process itself. Fans see one price. They join the queue. They wait for 20, 30, sometimes even 40 minutes. Then they reach the checkout page, and the price is no longer the same. It is higher. Some supporters try again during the next sales window. The same thing happens. Then it happens again. And that is when frustration begins to grow, because many fans no longer feel they are competing against other supporters. They feel as if they are competing against the system itself, a system that seems to move the goalposts every time they get closer. For years, World Cup tickets were viewed as something fans could plan for, save for, budget around. Now, for some supporters, the process feels far less predictable, and that uncertainty may be just as frustrating as the price itself. At first glance, this sounds like a technical issue, a consequence of overwhelming demand. But look a little deeper, and it raises a much bigger question. Is the World Cup simply reflecting market demand? Or is fan loyalty being turned into a bidding contest? A contest where the people willing to pay the most gain the greatest advantage. That is the question more and more supporters are beginning to ask. And while the debate over ticket prices continues to spread across social media, fan forums, and sports media outlets, another controversy is starting to emerge. This time, the argument is not about ticket prices. It is about the seats themselves. Who gets access to them? Who does not? And whether ordinary supporters are losing space inside the very tournament they helped build. That is the moment when this story begins to move far beyond dynamic pricing. Because the next controversy is not about what fans pay. It is about whether they can participate at all. While fans were still debating dynamic pricing, another issue began to emerge. This time, it was not about the price. It was about the seats. At first glance, that may sound like a minor detail, just another complaint about ticket categories. But interestingly, this issue struck a nerve with many supporters, because for some fans, it was not simply about where they would sit. It was about trust. When FIFA launched ticket sales for the 2026 World Cup, seats were divided into several categories. Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, Category 4. Supporters made their decisions based on that system. Many fans paid a premium for Category 1 tickets because they believed they were securing the best available locations within their section of the stadium. That was the understanding they purchased. Then, something changed. A new ticket class appeared. Front category. These seats were described as some of the best locations in the stadium, and that is when questions began to surface. If the best seats were now part of front category, what exactly had Category 1 buyers paid for? At first glance, this seems like a simple dispute over seating locations. But look more closely, and it reflects a much larger issue. Expectations. Fans do not just buy a seat. They buy an expectation. They make decisions based on the information available at the time of purchase. And when the structure changes afterward, some supporters feel that the rules have shifted after they already committed their money. That feeling quickly fueled debate, not only on social media, not only on football forums, but across consumer discussions in multiple countries. Because for many supporters, the concern was not necessarily that a new category existed. The concern was that it appeared after purchasing decisions had already been made. And once questions of transparency begin to emerge, the conversation can expand very quickly. What started as a ticketing dispute was increasingly being discussed as a consumer issue. An issue involving disclosures, expectations, and the way major sporting events communicate with customers. That is when the story became far more complicated, because it was no longer just FIFA responding to frustrated fans. The controversy began attracting attention from consumer advocates, legal observers, and regulatory authorities. And that brings us to the next chapter of the story. A chapter that moves beyond fan frustration and into the world of official scrutiny. Because only days before the 2026 World Cup was set to begin, authorities in the United States started asking questions of their own. The question is, what exactly convinced regulators that this situation deserved a closer look? For most of World Cup history, ticket controversies followed a familiar pattern. Fans complained. The media reported on it, and eventually, the story faded away. But this time felt different. Questions about ticket prices, questions about seating categories, questions about how FIFA's ticketing system was operating. These concerns were no longer being raised only by supporters. They were beginning to attract the attention of regulators, and that is when the situation became much more serious. Just days before the start of the 2026 World Cup, attorneys general in New York and New Jersey requested information related to FIFA's ticket sales process. California also began examining similar concerns. At first glance, this may appear to be little more than a routine administrative review. But look more closely, and the timing becomes difficult to ignore. The biggest sporting event on the planet was about to begin. Yet FIFA was still being asked to answer questions about its own ticketing system. According to regulators, the issue was not simply about how much tickets cost. It was also about transparency. Were fans given enough information before making a purchase? Were ticket categories clearly explained? Did the sales process create confusion about what buyers were actually receiving? Those are some of the questions now being examined. And what makes this story particularly interesting is where those questions lead, because they point toward a much larger issue. If millions of people still want to attend the World Cup, why do so many supporters feel that participation is becoming increasingly out of reach? Why are some lifelong fans deciding not to go at all? The answer may lie in the numbers. Numbers that have shocked many football supporters over the past several months. Numbers that have fueled frustration, debate, and growing skepticism across multiple countries. And that is where this story becomes even more controversial. Because once people started looking closely at the costs, the conversation moved beyond ticketing systems and regulatory reviews. It became a debate about affordability itself. And for many fans, that may be the most important question of all. If the investigations are focused on transparency, the numbers tell a different story. A story about accessibility. At first glance, FIFA has a valid argument. Demand for the 2026 World Cup is enormous. This is the biggest World Cup in history. Millions of people want tickets, and supply will always be limited. But that is where the debate begins. Because many concerns emerged when supporters started looking at actual prices, particularly on the official resale market. Some tickets appeared with asking prices reaching tens of thousands of dollars. Numbers so large that even fans accustomed to major sporting events found them difficult to believe, and that is when a new question began to surface. Is the World Cup still an experience that ordinary supporters can realistically access? Or is it gradually becoming an event reserved for those with exceptional spending power? At first glance, this appears to be a conversation about money. Nothing more. But look a little deeper, and it touches something much bigger. The atmosphere of the World Cup itself. What makes the tournament special is not only what happens on the pitch, it is what happens in the stands. The chants, the flags, the traveling supporters who spend years following their national teams, the fans who save money for months, sometimes years, just to be there. People like Alan Ross. They are part of what gives the World Cup its identity. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What happens if those supporters slowly disappear from the stadium? The World Cup could still break revenue records. It could still sell out every match. The numbers could still look impressive. But would it still feel the same? Would it still have the atmosphere that made generations of fans fall in love with the tournament? That is why the debate has expanded far beyond ticket prices. For many supporters, this is no longer simply a discussion about cost. It is a discussion about who gets to be inside the stadium when the World Cup begins, who can afford to participate, who gets left behind, and whether the people who built the culture of the World Cup are slowly being priced out of it. That is the concern increasingly being voiced by supporters around the world. And as those concerns continue to grow, fan organizations are beginning to speak more openly. Because for them, the issue is no longer about individual tickets. It is about the future identity of the World Cup itself. If the numbers made people nervous, the reaction from supporters revealed just how far this debate had spread. Over the past several months, fan organizations across Europe began collecting feedback from people who tried to purchase tickets for the 2026 World Cup. The stories sounded remarkably familiar. Prices changing during the buying process, difficulty understanding the final cost, confusion about seating categories, a growing feeling of being left behind. At first glance, these may seem like isolated complaints, a few frustrated customers sharing negative experiences. But look more closely, and a pattern begins to emerge. Supporters from different countries, different backgrounds, different national teams, yet many of them are asking the same question. Is the World Cup still meant for people like us? That question is what prompted fan groups to take action. They submitted formal complaints. They called for greater scrutiny of ticket sales practices. They urged FIFA to provide more transparency. And perhaps the most important detail is this: most of the people raising these concerns are not opposed to the World Cup. In fact, they may be among its most passionate supporters. They are the people who travel across continents to follow their teams, the people who plan entire years around major tournaments, the people who help create the atmosphere that makes the World Cup unique. That is precisely why they are worried. Because for them, this conversation is not really about tickets. It is about the direction of the tournament itself. At first glance, the debate appears to be focused on pricing and access. But beneath the surface lies a much larger question. What happens when a global event continues to grow in size, revenue, and commercial value? Can ordinary supporters remain at the center of the experience? Or do they gradually become spectators watching from the outside? And that is where all of the stories we have discussed begin to connect. Alan Ross, in Scotland. Dynamic pricing. The controversy surrounding seating categories. The regulatory reviews in the United States. The concerns raised by supporter organizations across Europe. At first, these stories seem unrelated. Separate controversies unfolding at the same time. But perhaps they are all pointing toward the same question. A question that could shape not only the 2026 World Cup, but the future of the tournament for years to come. Who is the World Cup really for? And as the opening match draws closer, that question may become more important than ever. Let's step back and look at all the stories we have just explored. A supporter from Scotland gives up on his dream of attending the World Cup. Thousands of fans express frustration over ticket prices that seem to change throughout the purchasing process. Questions emerge about seating categories. Regulators in the United States begin asking for answers. Supporter organizations across Europe file complaints and demand greater transparency. At first glance, these appear to be completely separate stories. Different countries, different people, different issues. But look more closely, and they all seem to revolve around the same question. Who is being prioritized in the modern World Cup? And that may be the most important part of this entire discussion. Because FIFA has never overseen a World Cup of this scale. More teams, more matches, more stadiums, more revenue. By almost every measurable standard, the tournament is growing. Yet at the same time, another feeling appears to be growing as well. A feeling that the distance between supporters and the tournament itself is becoming larger. Of course, FIFA has its own perspective. Demand is real. The costs of organizing a World Cup are real. Expanding football around the world requires enormous financial resources. That is part of the story. But critics focus on a different part. They are not asking whether FIFA should generate revenue. They are asking something else. Are ordinary supporters still at the center of the World Cup experience? Or are they gradually becoming secondary to larger commercial priorities? That is why all of these controversies eventually lead back to the same debate. The World Cup is expanding. But expanding for whom? At first glance, this seems like a story about football tickets. But look deeper, and it becomes a story about the future of the World Cup experience itself, about who gets to walk through the stadium gates, and who does not, about which voices are heard, and which voices feel increasingly distant from the event they helped make special. That may be the biggest question hanging over the tournament before a single ball is kicked, and it may remain part of the conversation long after the final whistle of the final match. Only a few days remain. Soon, the debates will give way to football. The stadium lights will come on, the matches will begin, and billions of people around the world will turn their attention to the 2026 World Cup. But when we look back at everything that happened before kickoff, one question still remains. A supporter from Scotland gave up on his World Cup dream. Fans debated rising ticket costs. Regulators in the United States began asking questions. Supporter groups across Europe filed complaints and called for greater transparency. At first glance, these seem like separate stories. Different people, different countries, different controversies. But look a little closer, and they all lead back to the same question. Who is the World Cup really serving? The supporters who have followed the tournament for generations? Or a football model that is becoming increasingly commercialized? Perhaps the World Cup is simply evolving in a way that was always inevitable. Perhaps global demand, rising costs, and growing expectations make these changes unavoidable. Or perhaps some supporters genuinely feel that the distance between themselves and the tournament is growing larger every year. The answer will likely depend on who you ask. What is clear is that this debate is no longer only about ticket prices. It is about identity, about access, about what the World Cup should represent in the future. Because the World Cup has always been more than a tournament. It has been a gathering place for supporters from every corner of the world. A celebration built not only by players on the pitch, but also by the fans in the stands. And that is why this conversation matters. So now we turn the question over to you. Do you believe the 2026 World Cup is becoming better than ever? Or do you think it is slowly losing some of the qualities that made it special in the first place? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe for more stories exploring the people, decisions, and controversies shaping the road to the 2026 World Cup. Thank you for watching.